I never expected to become the neighborhood's most wanted criminal when I moved into Oak Ridge Estates 3 months ago. The glossy brochure had promised peaceful living in a harmonious community, but failed to mention that our HOA president, Veronica Harrington, measured that peace with professional-grade decibel monitors and an iron fist. My first encounter with Veronica happened just 2 weeks after I moved in. I was unpacking my home office when a sharp knock startled me. Opening the door, I found myself face to face with a petite woman in her 50s, impeccably dressed in a powder blue pantsuit, her blonde bob not daring to move even in the gentle summer breeze. "Mr. Torres," she said, extending a manicured hand that matched her outfit. "I'm Veronica Harrington, president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. I wanted to personally welcome you to our community and provide you with our comprehensive rulebook." She handed me a binder that was easily 2 inches thick. I accepted it with what I hoped was a grateful smile. "Thank you, that's very kind. I'm Alex. I was actually planning to read through all the HOA guidelines online, but having a physical copy is great." Veronica's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Well, reading is fundamental, isn't it? Especially Section 7, regarding noise ordinances. We take our peace and quiet very seriously here at Oak Ridge." I nodded, somewhat confused by the pointed comment. "Of course, I'm actually a pretty quiet person by nature." She hummed in a tone that suggested she'd heard that line before. "Well, I'd start familiarizing yourself with the rules immediately. We had quite a few issues with the previous owner." Before I could ask what kind of issues, she was already walking away, calling over her shoulder, "Welcome to Oak Ridge, Mr. Torres. I'm sure we'll be seeing each other again soon." Little did I know just how prophetic those words would be. 2 days later, I received my first official warning. A cream-colored envelope with the HOA logo was slipped under my door. Inside was a notice claiming I had violated Section 7.3. Excessive noise after designated quiet hours, 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. I was baffled. The night in question, I had been in bed by 9:30 p.m., reading with my noise-canceling headphones on. I hadn't even flushed the toilet after 10 p.m., let alone made any significant noise. I immediately called the number listed on the notice. "Oak Ridge Estates, HOA, Veronica speaking," came the crisp response. "Hi, Veronica. This is Alex Torres from 427 Maple Lane. I just received a noise violation notice, and there must be some mistake. I was actually asleep when this supposed violation occurred." "Mr. Torres," she sighed as if speaking to a child, "we have documented evidence of excessive noise coming from your property at 11:47 p.m. A neighbor filed a formal complaint." "That's impossible. The notice is merely a warning, Mr. Torres, but please understand that subsequent violations will result in fines, starting at $150 and increasing with each incident." I took a deep breath. There was no point arguing without evidence. "Could you tell me what kind of noise was reported? Was it music, voices, something else?" The complaint cited mechanical humming and irregular thumping. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other matters to attend to." Before I could respond, the line went dead. Mechanical humming? Irregular thumping? I surveyed my nearly empty living room containing only a couch, a coffee table, and a small TV that had been turned off since 9 p.m. Nothing here could make those sounds. The only machinery running would have been my refrigerator, which was brand new and whisper quiet. What Veronica Harrington didn't know, what none of my neighbors knew yet, was that I, Alexander Torres, had spent the last 15 years as the lead acoustic engineer at Silent Space Technologies, designing soundproofing solutions for everything from recording studios to military installations. My doctoral thesis had focused on advanced noise cancellation in residential spaces, and I held 7 patents in acoustic insulation materials. When I purchased this house, the very first thing I did before moving in was completely retrofit it with my company's latest soundproofing technology. The walls were lined with acoustic dampening panels. The windows were triple glazed with gas-filled spaces between layers. The floors had cork underlayment beneath the hardwood. Even the ductwork had been wrapped in sound-absorbing material. My home wasn't just quiet. It was professionally engineered to be one of the quietest residential spaces in the country. Yet somehow, I was receiving noise complaints. I dismissed the first warning as a mistake, perhaps a mix-up with another address. But 3 days later, another notice arrived. Then, another. By the end of my first month, I had accumulated 6 violations, each more absurd than the last. The strange thing was the complaints were oddly specific, citing exact times and detailed descriptions of sounds that couldn't possibly be coming from my house. One even claimed that at 2:13 a.m., rhythmic bass music with occasional shouting had disturbed a neighbor's sleep. On that particular night, I had been in Denver, presenting at an acoustic engineering conference. Something wasn't adding up, and I was beginning to suspect that these violations weren't random at all. But why would Veronica target me? What could she possibly have against a new resident she barely knew? The answer came unexpectedly one evening when I was chatting with my next-door neighbor, Eleanor Jenkins, an elderly woman who had lived in Oak Ridge for over 20 years. "Oh, you bought old Mr. Finch's place," she said, pouring me a glass of iced tea as we sat on her porch. "You know his grandson was supposed to inherit that house." "I didn't know that," I replied. "The realtor never mentioned anything about it." Eleanor nodded knowingly. "Well, that's because the grandson, Bradley, got into some legal trouble and couldn't take possession right away. By the time everything was sorted out, the house had been on the market for months, and you had already bought it." "That's unfortunate for him," I said. "But what does this have to do with the noise complaints?" Eleanor leaned in closer, lowering her voice even though we were alone. "Bradley is Veronica's nephew. She had been telling everyone how excited she was to have family moving into the neighborhood. When you bought the house instead..." She trailed off, letting me connect the dots. Suddenly, it all made perfect sense. This wasn't about noise at all. This was about revenge. "But that's absurd," I stammered, nearly spilling my iced tea. "She's issuing official violations because she's upset about who bought a house. Isn't that some kind of abuse of power?" Eleanor patted my hand sympathetically. "Welcome to Oak Ridge, dear. Veronica has been running this place like her personal kingdom for 8 years now. Nobody challenges her because nobody wants to become her next target." I thanked Eleanor for the tea and the information, my mind racing as I walked the short distance back to my house. The golden evening light cast long shadows across perfectly manicured lawns, and through windows I could see families going about their evening routines. This was supposed to be my sanctuary, my home. Instead, it was becoming a battleground. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Veronica's vendetta and what it might escalate to. Would the fines get steeper? Would she find other violations to cite me for? How far would she go? By morning, I had made a decision. If Veronica wanted to play games with noise violations, she had chosen the wrong opponent. I wasn't just going to defend myself. I was going to build a case so solid that it would be impossible to ignore. My first step was to install a comprehensive monitoring system. As luck would have it, I had been developing a new acoustic monitoring prototype for silent space. A network of ultra-sensitive microphones that could detect, measure, and record sound levels both inside and outside a building. The system was originally designed for urban planning commissions to monitor noise pollution, but it would serve my purposes perfectly. Over the weekend, I set up sensors throughout my property, inside every room, on the exterior walls, and at the property boundaries. Each sensor was connected to a central database that logged decibel levels continuously, providing irrefutable evidence of exactly how much noise was, or wasn't, coming from my home. On Monday morning, I received another violation notice. This one claimed that at 1:24 a.m., there had been shouting and door slamming from my property that had woken up multiple neighbors. I smiled as I checked my monitoring system. Between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m., the highest exterior sound level recorded had been 31 decibels, equivalent to a whisper in a quiet library and well below the 45 decibel nighttime limit specified in the HOA regulations. Inside my house, where I had been peacefully sleeping, the levels were even lower. The violation was completely fabricated, and now I had proof. But I wasn't ready to confront Veronica yet. One data point wasn't enough. I needed a pattern. So I continued to collect evidence, documenting each absurd violation alongside my acoustic readings. 2 weeks and 4 more violations later, I had compiled an impressive dossier. But I needed more than just my own measurements to build a bulletproof case. I needed witnesses. My opportunity came at the neighborhood block party, a quarterly tradition in Oak Ridge Estates. I arrived early to help set up, making a point to introduce myself to as many neighbors as possible. Most were friendly, if a bit reserved. A few gave me curious looks, as if they'd heard something about me, but weren't sure what to believe. I spotted Veronica holding court near the dessert table, surrounded by what appeared to be her inner circle. 3 women who nodded enthusiastically at everything she said. She stiffened when she saw me, her smile freezing in place. "Mr. Torres," she called out, her voice carrying across the park. "How nice of you to join us. I trust you're not planning any loud parties tonight." A few people chuckled nervously, and I felt eyes turn in my direction. This was her territory, and she was making sure I knew it. I smiled broadly. "Not at all, Veronica. I value peace and quiet as much as anyone. In fact, sound engineering is literally my profession." Her smile faltered slightly. "Your profession?" "Yes, I'm an acoustic engineer. I design soundproofing systems for a living. Silent Space Technologies? We're the industry leaders in noise reduction solutions." A small crowd had gathered now, intrigued by our exchange. I could see Veronica calculating, trying to determine if I was bluffing. "How fascinating," she said finally, her voice tight. "Perhaps you could give us a lecture sometime on how to be better neighbors?" "I'd be happy to," I replied cheerfully. "In fact, I'd love to discuss some of the recent noise complaints in the neighborhood. It seems there might be some acoustical anomalies worth investigating." A muscle twitched in Veronica's jaw, but before she could respond, we were interrupted by a tall man in his 40s. "Did you say Silent Space Technologies?" he asked, extending his hand. "I'm Dr. Marcus Chen. I used your acoustic panels when I built my home recording studio last year. They're remarkable." "Dr. Chen is our resident pianist," explained an older woman nearby. "He performs with the City Symphony." I shook Marcus's hand enthusiastically. "It's great to meet a customer. How's the studio working out?" "Brilliantly. I can record at 3 a.m. and my wife doesn't hear a thing from the bedroom." He laughed, then added, "Though I have received some strange noise complaints recently." "You too?" asked a younger woman who had been listening to our conversation. "I'm Priya Sharma from Willow Court. I've gotten 3 violation notices this month for loud gatherings that never happened." "Same here," added another neighbor, a man in his 60s. "Got cited for power tools at midnight when I was out of town visiting my daughter." Suddenly, people were sharing similar stories all around me. It seemed Veronica had been running quite the campaign of fabricated violations throughout the neighborhood. And, from the confused and angry faces, it was clear many residents were only just now realizing they weren't the only targets. Veronica's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "Perhaps we should focus on enjoying the party," she said loudly, trying to regain control of the situation. "The hot dogs are ready." But the conversation had taken on a life of its own. Small groups formed throughout the park, neighbors comparing notes about their mysterious violations. I moved from group to group, introducing myself and collecting stories. By the end of the evening, I had a list of 17 residents who had received questionable noise complaints, along with their contact information and permission to include their experiences in any formal complaint I might file. I also made some valuable allies. Marcus Chen offered to help me analyze my acoustic data. Priya Sharma, who turned out to be a paralegal at a law firm specializing in property disputes, volunteered to review the HOA bylaws for potential violations on Veronica's part, and Eleanor Jenkins promised to rally the old guard of the neighborhood, longtime residents whose opinions carried weight. As the party wound down and I helped clean up, I felt a tap on my shoulder. It was a young man I hadn't met before, maybe in his early 30s, with Veronica's sharp blue eyes. "I'm Bradley Finch," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "My aunt thinks I don't know what she's been doing, but I've heard her on the phone, calling in fake complaints." My eyebrows shot up. "You're Veronica's nephew, the one who was supposed to buy my house?" He nodded, looking embarrassed. "Look, I'm sorry about all this. I told Aunt Veronica I didn't care about that house. I found a better place across town anyway. But she took it personally, said it was the principle of the thing. She's always been intense about getting her way." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, genuinely curious. Bradley sighed. "Because what she's doing isn't just petty. It's wrong, and I'm tired of her thinking she can manipulate everyone around her without consequences." He handed me a flash drive. "Here's copies of texts and emails where she specifically mentions targeting you and others with fake violations. I thought you might need them." I stared at the small device in my palm, hardly believing my luck. "Thank you," I said sincerely. "This could make a real difference." He shrugged. "Just make it count, okay? And maybe don't mention where you got this. Family holidays are awkward enough already." With that, he walked away, leaving me holding perhaps the most damning evidence yet. The next morning, I woke to the sound of banging on my door. It was 7:15 a.m., barely past the quiet hours. I threw on a robe and rushed to answer, finding Veronica on my doorstep, flanked by two stern-faced men in polo shirts embroidered with the HOA logo. "Mr. Torres," she said, her voice clipped, "the HOA board has called an emergency disciplinary hearing regarding your continuous noise violations. You're requested to appear tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. in the community center." She thrust an official-looking document into my hands. I skimmed it quickly. According to this notice, I had accumulated 12 violations in just under 2 months, putting me in the chronic offender category. The hearing would determine whether to begin assessing escalating fines, place a lien on my property, or pursue other punitive measures. "This is ridiculous," I said calmly. "None of these violations are valid." "The evidence suggests otherwise," Veronica replied smugly. "Multiple complaints from multiple sources over an extended period. The board takes such patterns very seriously." I folded the notice carefully and tucked it into my robe pocket. "I'll be there," I assured her, "with my own evidence." Something flickered across her face. Uncertainty, perhaps, but it was quickly replaced by her usual confident smile. "Excellent. The board appreciates cooperation." With a nod to her companions, she turned and marched back down my walkway, head high, certain of her victory. Little did she know, I'd been preparing for this moment since the day I received my first violation notice. And now, thanks to the block party and Bradley's flash drive, I had even more ammunition than I'd hoped for. I spent the entire day and much of the night preparing my case. I compiled my acoustic data into clear, easy-to-understand graphs showing the actual noise levels from my property during each alleged violation. I organized statements from neighbors who had experienced similar false complaints. I carefully reviewed the evidence Bradley had provided, finding explicit messages where Veronica instructed another board member to write up Torres for noise on Thursday night. Doesn't matter what time. Most damning of all was an email thread where Veronica discussed targeting specific homeowners who had opposed her in previous HOA votes, describing noise violations as the easiest way to keep people in line, because they were subjective and hard to disprove. Or at least, they would have been hard to disprove for someone who wasn't a world-class acoustic engineer with state-of-the-art monitoring equipment. By the time the hearing arrived the following evening, I was exhausted but confident. I arrived at the community center 20 minutes early, carrying a laptop, a portable projector, and a thick binder of documentation. The meeting room was already half full, with curious residents eager to watch the proceedings. Veronica sat at a long table at the front, alongside 4 other board members, all looking somber and official. As I set up my equipment, more people filed in. I recognized many faces from the block party: Priya, Marcus, Eleanor, and others who had shared their stories with me. They nodded encouragingly as they took their seats. By 7 p.m., the room was packed, with people standing along the walls. Veronica called the meeting to order, her voice echoing in the suddenly quiet room. "We are here to address the case of Alexander Torres, resident at 427 Maple Lane, regarding multiple and continuing noise violations," she announced, looking down at her notes rather than at me. "The board has reviewed the complaints and finds sufficient cause to proceed with punitive measures as outlined in Section 12 of the HOA Covenant." She finally looked up, fixing me with a cold stare. "Mr. Torres, do you wish to make a statement before the board renders its decision?" I stood, straightening my tie. "Actually, Madam President, I've prepared a comprehensive presentation that I believe will resolve this matter conclusively." Veronica's lips thinned. "We'll allow 5 minutes. The bylaws allow homeowners facing disciplinary action a minimum of 30 minutes to present their defense," Priya called out from the audience, holding up a dog-eared copy of the HOA regulations. Section 15.7, Paragraph 2. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. One of the other board members, a nervous-looking man with glasses, leaned over to whisper something to Veronica. She frowned but nodded reluctantly. "Very well. 30 minutes, Mr. Torres." "Thank you," I said, turning on the projector. "I'll try to be concise." For the next 20 minutes, I methodically dismantled every single noise complaint filed against me. I showed time-stamped acoustic readings demonstrating the actual sound levels from my property during alleged violations, all well within permitted limits. I explained the advanced soundproofing technologies implemented throughout my home, complete with technical specifications and installation records. "As you can see," I said, advancing to a new slide, "it is physically impossible for the described noise levels to have originated from my property. In fact, based on the acoustic profile of my home, even if I were to hold a rock concert in my living room, the sound detectable at the property line would still fall within daytime noise limits." The audience was captivated, many taking notes or nodding along. The board members shifted uncomfortably, except for Veronica, who maintained her icy composure. "Furthermore," I continued, "I've discovered that mine is not an isolated case." I displayed a map of the neighborhood with red dots indicating homes that had received questionable noise violations. 17 other residents have reported receiving similar unfounded complaints, often coinciding with instances where they had disagreed with board policies or decisions. This caused an immediate reaction, with people in the audience turning to their neighbors, whispering and pointing. Veronica's face hardened as she banged her gavel for order. "This is irrelevant to your specific case, Mr. Torres," she said sharply. "On the contrary," I countered, "it establishes a pattern of behavior that directly relates to the validity of the complaints against me. And, speaking of patterns—" I hesitated briefly, considering the ethics of using Bradley's evidence, but the neighborhood deserved to know the truth, and I could present it without revealing my source. "I have obtained communications between HOA board members that explicitly discuss fabricating noise violations as a means of targeting specific homeowners." I displayed several redacted emails and text messages on the screen, careful to blur any identifying information about Bradley while keeping Veronica's name and incriminating statements clearly visible. A collective gasp filled the room. One of the board members, an older woman, audibly exclaimed, "Oh my God, Veronica!" Veronica leapt to her feet. "This is outrageous. Those are private communications obtained illegally." "Actually," I replied calmly, "these were provided voluntarily by a concerned party. Nothing illegal about it. and their authenticity can be verified through metadata and electronic records if necessary. The room erupted in shouting and questions. The board members huddled together, urgently whispering among themselves. Veronica's face had gone from red to white, her carefully maintained composure crumbling as she realized the extent of the evidence against her. When order was finally restored, the nervous man with glasses, who introduced himself as Howard Jenkins, HOA Vice President, cleared his throat and addressed the room. In light of this unexpected information, the board will need to adjourn to discuss appropriate next steps. All pending noise violations against Mr. Torres and other residents are suspended until further notice. "That's not necessary," Veronica interjected, trying to regain control. "I move that we—" "With all due respect, Madam President," Howard interrupted firmly, "given the serious nature of these allegations and your direct involvement in them, I believe you should recuse yourself from this matter entirely." The three other board members nodded in agreement, and for perhaps the first time in Oak Ridge Estates history, Veronica Harrington found herself outvoted right from the start. The meeting was adjourned amid excited chatter. As people filed out, many stopped to congratulate me or share their own stories of dealing with Veronica's tyranny. Priya was already discussing forming a resident action committee to review all recent HOA actions. Marcus was talking about running for the board in the next election. Even Howard Jenkins approached me, apologizing for not recognizing what had been happening sooner. The board had no idea she was fabricating complaints, he assured me, looking genuinely distressed. We trusted her judgment as president. "I understand," I told him. "When you're only hearing one side of the story, it's hard to know what's really going on." As the crowd thinned, I noticed Veronica sitting alone at the board table, staring at nothing, her perfect posture finally slumped in defeat. Part of me felt sorry for her. It couldn't be easy to be publicly exposed like that. But she had brought it on herself by abusing her position and targeting innocent neighbors. I packed up my equipment and headed for the door, eager to get home and finally enjoy my house without the cloud of fake violations hanging over me. As I reached the exit, I heard footsteps behind me. Mr. Torres. I turned to find Veronica standing there, her face a mask of controlled dignity despite her obvious distress. "I suppose you think you've won," she said quietly. I regarded her thoughtfully. Despite everything, I didn't want more conflict. This wasn't about winning or losing, Veronica. It was about truth and fairness. No one should be targeted with false accusations, especially by someone in a position of authority. Her eyes narrowed. "You have no idea what it takes to maintain standards in a community like this. Sometimes people need motivation to follow the rules." "That may be true," I conceded, "but fabricating violations isn't motivation. It's harassment, and it's not legal." Veronica's composure cracked slightly, fear flickering across her face. "Are you planning to take legal action? Because I assure you the HOA has excellent lawyers." "The HOA might," I agreed, "but would they represent you personally in a case where you acted without their knowledge or approval?" "That's a question worth considering." She paled further, and I realized she hadn't thought about that aspect. The HOA's insurance and legal protections might not cover rogue actions by a board member, especially one who had been deliberately misleading the rest of the board. I softened my tone. "Look, I didn't come here looking for a fight. I just wanted to live peacefully in my new home. If you drop this vendetta against me and the other homeowners you've targeted, I have no interest in pursuing the matter further." Veronica studied me, clearly trying to determine if my offer was genuine or if this was some kind of trap. Finally, she gave a short, stiff nod. "Fine. Consider it dropped." She turned to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, it wasn't personal. Not really. It was about maintaining control. "It felt pretty personal," I replied honestly, "especially given your connection to my house's previous owner." Surprise flickered across her face. "You know about Bradley?" "I know he's your nephew, and that he was supposed to buy the house before I did. Eleanor Jenkins filled me in. Veronica's lips thinned at the mention of Eleanor. That woman never could mind her own business. She sighed heavily. Yes, Bradley was supposed to buy the house. I had it all planned out, the perfect neighborhood with my family right next door. But then he got himself into trouble. The sale fell through, and you showed up instead. And you decided to make my life miserable as punishment, I concluded. She had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. As I said, it wasn't entirely personal. You were new, unknown. I needed to establish boundaries. By fabricating noise complaints against someone who literally designs soundproof spaces for a living, I said, unable to keep a touch of irony from my voice. To my surprise, Veronica let out a short, genuine laugh. Yes, well, that part was unfortunate timing on my part. She straightened her jacket, visibly pulling herself together. I should go. The board will be waiting to begin their deliberations. Good luck, I said, meaning it. Despite everything, I didn't want to see her humiliated or ostracized. I just wanted the harassment to stop. She nodded once more and walked away, her heels clicking on the polished floor. I watched her go, wondering if this was truly the end of the matter or just a temporary truce. As it turned out, it was a bit of both. The following week, an official letter arrived from the HOA board. All noise violations against me had been formally dismissed, and the board extended their sincere apologies for any inconvenience caused. They also announced a special election to fill recently vacated board positions, with a pointed note that all homeowners in good standing were eligible to run. I later learned from Howard that Veronica hadn't been officially removed from the board, but she had been asked to step down as president while an independent review of HOA practices was conducted. Rather than face that humiliation, she had resigned entirely. The special election drew record participation from the community. Priya Sharma was elected president, running on a platform of transparency and fair enforcement. Marcus Chen became treasurer, promising to review the HOA's financial records with a forensic accountant. 3 other new members joined the board, all committed to reform. Their first official act was to revise the noise ordinance, requiring that all complaints be accompanied by objective evidence, time-stamped recordings, decibel readings, or multiple witness statements. They also implemented a new policy requiring board members to recuse themselves from decisions involving personal conflicts of interest. As for Veronica, she kept a low profile for several months. Neighborhood gossip suggested she was considering selling her house and moving to Florida, where her sister lived. But just as those rumors reached their peak, something unexpected happened. I was working in my front yard one Saturday morning, planting a new row of shrubs along the fence when a familiar figure approached. Veronica looked different, more casual in jeans and a simple blouse, her hair pulled back in a ponytail rather than set in its usual rigid style. "Mr. Torres," she greeted me, her voice lacking its former imperial tone. "Do you have a moment?" I stood, brushing dirt from my hands. "Of course, and please call me Alex." She nodded, seeming uncharacteristically nervous. "Alex, then. I wanted to apologize. Properly. What I did was wrong, and I'm sorry." I blinked in surprise. This was the last thing I had expected. "Thank you. That means a lot." "I've been doing some thinking," she continued, looking around at the neighborhood rather than directly at me, "about why I felt such a need for control, why I couldn't just let people live their lives." "And what conclusions did you reach?" I asked, genuinely curious. She smiled slightly. "That's between me and my new therapist, but I am trying to change, to be better." She finally met my eyes. "I'm not leaving Oak Ridge. This is my home, and I want to make things right, be part of the community in a healthier way." "I think that's admirable," I told her sincerely. "Everyone deserves a second chance." Veronica hesitated, then said, "Actually, I also came to ask for your professional advice. Since you're an expert in sound engineering, My kitchen renovation is creating some issues with noise traveling to my upstairs bedroom. I wondered if you might have some suggestions." I couldn't help smiling at the irony. "I'd be happy to help. Why don't you come over for coffee next weekend and we can discuss some options?" She agreed readily, and as she walked away, I marveled at how differently things had turned out than I had expected. When I bought this house, I thought I was just getting a quiet place to call home. Instead, I had found myself at the center of a neighborhood revolution, bringing down a petty tyrant only to see her begin a journey of redemption. 6 months later, Oak Ridge Estates was a transformed community. The reformed HOA functioned as it should, maintaining common areas, organizing social events, and ensuring reasonable standards without overreaching. Neighbors who had previously kept to themselves, fearful of drawing Veronica's attention, now freely socialized and cooperated on community projects. As for Veronica, she had indeed changed. While never exactly warm and fuzzy, she channeled her organizational skills and attention to detail into more positive outlets. She volunteered to coordinate the Neighborhood Emergency Preparedness Committee, where her exacting standards were actually appreciated. She still noted when lawns needed mowing or trash cans were left out too long, but now she offered to help rather than issuing violations. And me? I found myself unexpectedly content. My home was everything I had hoped for. Peaceful, comfortable, a true sanctuary after long days at work. But more than that, I had found a community where I belonged, where my expertise was valued, and where I had made a difference. In an ironic twist that still made me smile, I eventually became the HOA's unofficial noise consultant, helping mediate the few genuine noise complaints that arose and advising homeowners on simple, cost-effective ways to reduce sound transmission between properties. Even more surprising was my evolving relationship with Veronica. While we would never be best friends, we developed a mutual respect that occasionally verged on genuine camaraderie. She became one of my most enthusiastic referrals, sending clients my way whenever friends or family mentioned noise issues in their homes. Bradley Finch, Veronica's nephew, eventually moved back to Oak Ridge after all, purchasing a house just 2 streets over from mine. At the housewarming party he threw, I watched Veronica interact with her nephew, affectionate but no longer controlling, genuinely happy for him rather than focused on her own plans. It was perhaps the clearest sign of how much she had changed. "You know," Bradley said to me as we stood on his new deck watching the sunset over the neighborhood, "in a weird way, you buying that house was the best thing that could have happened. For Aunt Veronica, for the community, for everyone." I nodded, taking a sip of my drink as I looked out at the peaceful streets of Oak Ridge, where neighbors chatted on front porches and children played freely without fear of arbitrary rules or punishments. "Sometimes," I replied, "the loudest statement you can make is establishing peace and quiet." He laughed and raised his glass in a toast. "To the quietest troublemaker Oak Ridge Estates has ever seen." I clinked my glass against his, smiling at the apt description. In my career as an acoustic engineer, I had always focused on creating spaces where unwanted noise couldn't intrude. But, here in Oak Ridge, I had learned that some kinds of noise, the sounds of people standing up for what's right, of communities coming together, of truth being spoken, were worth amplifying. And that was a lesson in acoustics I hadn't expected to learn.